While you do that, I'll give just a brief intro that I'm sure you're better at doing than I am, but hey, I'll give it my best shot. Like I said, John's been on the board with me at Trinity Valley for several years now. Um, he has provided some educational classes for the club out in his bee yard. Um, having been familiar with his bee yard in that context, I consider it an especially well laid out and well thought out yard the way he's done it. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what he has to say to us about it today.
Thanks, Ryan. Hopefully you can hear me okay.
I can hear you.
Perfect. Well, I'm going to get started. Just to start out real quick, I've heard said that if you ask 10 beekeepers a question, you may get 15 different answers, and they may all be correct. So I'm going to show you and share my experience. But beekeeping is about learning, and I learn something new every day when I work with my bees. So take some opportunity when you get out and get your bees to learn some things. They're definitely going to tell you when you do things wrong. There's no doubt. So with that said, welcome to my bee yard, and I'm going to try and make this a little more fun. I'm not going to be all slides. I'm going to try and present some videos and share you a little bit about my bee yard and how things are set up, and we'll go from there. And feel free to ask questions too. I can't see them right now, but I will come back and we'll bring up chat and we'll chat. As Ryan said, I'm John Wright. I run, along with my wife, Two Doves Apiaries, Two Doves Bees and Gardens. And we're at the very top of Lake Ray Hubbard, just a little north and east of Dallas, outside of Wiley, Texas. And we have a lot of fun with what we're doing out here. One other thing, not traditional, but throughout the Celtic tradition, the bee was a protected creature, and that's mostly because bees made honey, and honey is good, and honey made mead, which is considered a drink that appears in paradise as nectar of the gods, apparently, and it's purported to have medicinal qualities. With that said, product of the hive, and I'm going to cheer for a new year and a better year to all of you. What is a bee yard? Beekeepers often talk about bee yards and their bee yard and coming to my bee yard and what is where it's at and all that good stuff. Basically, a bee yard is a place where beekeepers keep their beehives. That can be in their backyard, can be out on farms, can be just about any place, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. The apiary is really the official term for a bee yard, but a lot of people have trouble spelling that, and sometimes I do too. So bee yard, apiary is the real term for a bee yard. Whether you have 1 or 100 or 1,000, bee yard is a bee yard and apiary, and a well-designed one makes life a lot easier, especially when you're working with bees. Just a brief kind of talk about what makes a bee-friendly yard. And I pulled this from another talk that I give, but essentially there's 4 essential elements. Choosing plants that are best suited for attracting bees. This can be your bees, can be local bees, can be native bees. In my bee yard, we see native bees, wasps, honeybees, bumblebees. If there's a pollinator, we set it up so that they're welcome and they come, which also presents some other things about feeding, and we may hit on that a little bit later. But another thing is water source. Water is probably one of the biggest resources that you really need to look at providing your bees. I'll show you a video of what we do for them here. I'm at the very top of the lake. Lake Ray Hubbard is probably, I'm going to say 700 feet, maybe 1,000 feet from my bees, but I still provide a bee waterer. The closer I can make the bee waterer to the bees, the easier it is on them and the less that they have to travel. And of course, the less that my neighbors have to worry about my bees too. Just a real kind of talk about my bee yard where I live. I'm in a neighborhood where the lots are about 1.25 to 3 acres. I have neighbors. I may get to show you a little video where I show you where all of my neighbors are in relation to my bees in my backyard. But anyway, we'll get to that. Water source, definitely in the summer is huge. And bees are still coming to my water even now. So even if it's not hot, you want to provide some shelter, some type of protection from wind, rain, cold. We'll talk a little bit about that. And then habitat for bees and other pollinators. And then, I don't think I'm going to get into insecticides and stuff, but, it's plays a part in a bee-friendly yard. Limit or eliminate the use of insecticides. To be honest, I still do have fire ants, and you might find some Amdro in my my workshop. I don't like them. Bee yard setup. How much space do you need for a bee yard? You can see it in the picture I have here. This is not mine. It's one that I pulled. There's a couple of beehives right on the backside of somebody's house, right next to their AC. I don't know that I would choose to do that, but it can be done, and obviously that person has done that. And you might see that they have neighbors fairly close by. So you can put them into a neighborhood. Typically a small backyard, if you have it set up right, you can do 3 or 4 hives, and I've seen more. I've seen less. So. So you may be able to put in more. The more you put in, the more issues you may have. You could have issues with your neighbors, could have issues with bees getting resources. If your goal is to produce any honey or get any honey, the more you have, the less likely it is you're going to get them. The more beehives you have, because that's going to be spread across all of them, and they're going to need some amount to continue their the health of the hive. You want to be able to work with your bees. I can't really tell in this picture, but it looks awfully tight to me. I don't know that you can get around the backside of the hives there in this picture, but typically I like to work on either the sides or the back of my hives. And depending on how you have them set up, it's easier or less easy. The easier you make it to work on them, the more likely it is you're going to work on them and do what you need to do. The more difficult it is, the more likely it is you're going to be a bee haver and cause issues in your neighborhood. If it's too hard to work on them, you just typically won't work on them. Hive stands. I'm going to show you some examples of some hive stands. And how I do them. There's a wide number of ways to set up beehives and hive stands. I know earlier we saw some pictures with some ideas to keep ants out. I haven't had much luck in keeping ants out of my hives, other than just my continuous battle with ants. We have ants; they're going to find a way in. And hopefully you can limit how much they get in. I don't know that they bother the bees so much, although they can cause a problem. There is no doubt. If you have hives in a small neighborhood, you might want to think about screening. I've seen some ideas of screening your beehives away from your neighbors, and that's not a bad thing, not necessarily to hide the bees, but it's also, you can set them up so that the bees have an obstacle and not a direct flight path right to your neighbor's back door or whatever. So it provides some obstacle for the bees, especially if you're in a smaller neyborhood. And I'll show you some of how mine is set up, and we'll talk a little bit about that flight path and things like that. We can't control where the bees fly. We can kind of put some obstacles in, as I mentioned, but bees are what's the term I've heard? Wild venomous creatures. And when they're loose, they fly where they want to go, and that's one of those things you have to be aware of. keeping them away from walkways and places where people have to walk directly in front of them. You probably want to avoid that. Here's an actual picture of one of my waterers, my bee waterer. And I'll show you a video of it here later. One of the best things you can do, even if you didn't have bees and weren't a beekeeper, one of the best things you can do is provide a watering station for pollinators, including honeybees. And this is just one example of a way to do that. Water is just so important, especially around here in the heat of summer. And one note about bees and water and watering stations, don't let them run dry. If you let the watering station run dry, the likelihood of the bees coming back to it is pretty minimal. They will come back if you continuous and keep working at it. But if you don't let it run dry to begin with, and if they find that resource, they'll just keep coming back, and it'll be good. One note about this this watering station that I have, this red flower pot in the middle, that holds, oh gosh, I want to say probably about 20 gallons of water. And it's not uncommon in the heat of summer for that thing to be drained. You'd be surprised at how fast the bees take the water. Other considerations, we talked about how tight it is to work your bees and where you put them up. And if you have in your mind when you set up your bee yard and your bees that you're going to need to take care of them, some of the things that you want to keep in mind is it takes time and effort, and putting your bees in the location that may have a major impact on your beekeeping endeavor. If they're far out and you have to drive to your bees, there's some things that you want to consider about management aspects. How are you going to treat for mites? Are you going to treat for mites? Small hive beetles. There's management aspects of your choices of where you put your bees. Do you need power? One of the things that we run here is a Mighty Mite heat treat, and that requires power. So that's something to think about. You can do it out in the field if you've got a small generator, or if you have them in your backyard. Obviously, you can run extension cords for power. And water, and again, that's one of those things. But just to keep in mind where you're going to put your bees and all the aspects that go along with it. It's not just plopping them out there and walk away and say, hey, I'll see you next month or whatever. There's some things that you have to take into consideration. Oh, one of my favorite things, bees and bee poop. This car that you see is not my car, but my car has looked like this. Those little yellow dots, if you're parked outside, you're going to find them if you have bees around your neighborhood. Obviously, that car has been parked very close or been parked for quite a while near some major colonies. Every time I go up to my truck, there's little yellow dots. So you will have it, and you will see bees. One of the things you need to plan on when you're getting into beekeeping is expanding. The bees are going to expand whether you plan for it or not. So better to plan for it. The springtime bee populations tend to explode, and you want to keep that in mind when you're putting your bees out there. Keep an eye on it. They will swarm. Obviously, in this lower picture there is a swarm of bees that have found a house to land on, and who knows, they may find a way into that house. I do swarm captures locally. Over the past 4 years, I want to say we probably caught somewhere between 30 and 50 swarms of bees. I build swarm traps, and I try to catch them before they move into people's houses. There's one particular house that's not far from where I am that I've caught upwards of 30 bee swarms from that 1 yard alone. They had bees that moved into their house. I put up a swarm trap right where the bees were finding their way in, and I've caught almost 30 swarms from that one location. That's another thing to note, that if you are successful in catching a swarm of bees, that you're likely to see more swarms of bees in that same exact location. They can smell where other bees have been, so you will see more of them. but plan for it. Plan to take care of your bees. Plan to keep an eye on them. And know that you're likely going to have to plan for expansion. One of the things that you can do is split your hives, and you can either sell nukes yourself or donate them to the club as for kids. We try to do a kids program, and every year we're looking for bees to provide them for the kids. So that's an option, or someone else in the bee club. So just keep an eye. It's one of those things to consider. Before we go to the bee yard, you should really think about having a plan. I don't willy-nilly like to go out to my bee yard and just say, okay, I'm going to go to the bee yard today and let's see what's going on, and pop the top and start opening beehives. It's best to go in with a plan. Know what you're going to do before you go. Do you need to look at a hive? Is there one that you suspect that's having some trouble? You don't want to just go out and say, oh, there's a big strong one, pop the top and start digging in. They will let you know very quickly that you probably don't want to do that. So not that you can't do it, but plan for it. Keep an eye out, when you go out there. Are you going to need some additional hardware? Are you going to make splits? Do you need more frames? Do you need to put feeders on your colonies? So have that stuff at hand. If you're going to feed them, figure out, is it the time of year for feeding? Do they need it? You don't want them to die. You don't want to feed them necessarily if you're going to try and harvest honey. But, if a bee colony needs food, you don't want them to die. It's better to feed them and not worry about the honey, worry about honey at another time. And then also, plan for the what if. If you need an extra super, it's that time of the year, the bees are growing exponentially, and it's like all of a sudden, they're out of space. I need to do something. Be aware of the time. If you're going to need the extra super, if you're going to need frames, extra lids, bottom boards, personal protection equipment, and all that good stuff. Also, one of the first things I do before I even go out to my bee yard, before I put on my bee jacket, I do wear a bee jacket. I start my smoker. First thing, I sit out here in front of my workshop. You're in my workshop with me. But first thing I do is get the smoker lit, make sure it's going. I got a good round of smoke going, get on my bee jacket, know what my plan is, and then I go out there. Some ideas for different types of smoker fuel. Obviously, we can buy smoker pellets, the little wood ones. I've got bigger ones, little ones. I've heard you can actually use the ones that come from fireplaces or built for smoking meats and stuff. I understand that they work. They may work. I've never used those. Dry grass or weeds, burlap, cow patties. I think we might have a bag of cow patties in here somewhere that we've burned that before. Cut up old jeans. If I can find an old pair of jeans that's got a hole, instead of throwing them away, I'll just cut them up into little slices or whatever, just some patches, and I'll store them in a bag and use those for smoker fuel. And it works really well, by the way. The denim cut up jeans work really well. I cut out the metal so that I don't have any metal in there, but it works really well. Not all beehives will need smoke. And you'll see a lot of people talk about, spraying with sugar water, which it'll work. Haven't been very successful with it, but I do use it. There is a good time for using spritzing bees with sugar water. And I know we heard someone earlier, Gretchen, I think, talking about spraying a mist of sugar water on swarms. That's a great idea. It's definitely handy to have. But if you open a hive that might be a little more defensive, let's say, you're probably likely going to want that smoker. Smoke will be your friend. And it's better to have it going before you need it than to all of a sudden have that oh crap moment and it's like this colony needs something, and then try and light a smoker when you got a couple hundred bees flying around trying to kill you. Anyway, when you light your smoker, make sure you have a way to extinguish it. especially if you're having to travel to your bees, if they're out somewhere and not in your backyard. Make sure you have a way to extinguish your smoker. They get really hot and they'll burn the crap out of you if you let them touch. And I think Gretchen also mentioned about somebody burning a hole into their veil. It'll happen if you're not careful. Personal protective equipment. I wear it. I see videos where people don't use a veil or gloves or jackets. That's good for them. I use it. I put a veil on, I put a jacket on, and then I've got ventilated pants and a whole suit on standby. I've had angry hives before, and I'll tell you a little story about that here in a minute or two, but I've had angry hives before, and I know some people on this call know that I've had angry hives before. They will quickly let you know that a jacket is not enough. You can't work them barehanded, and they'll come and sting your face all up and down. So be prepared. That's one of the big things I want to try and get across to you is not that you have to wear it. If your bees are great, that's fantastic. But be prepared, because a hive can be great one day and you get air on the wrong day and they'll let you know. So one of those good things to be aware of. A bee cart or wagon. I don't have to walk too far to my hives. From here where I'm sitting at, it's probably a couple hundred feet to my hives. But carrying boxes, lots of boxes, frames, I'm carrying honey back from the bee yard up to the front of the property here. They're heavy. I strongly suggest having a bee cart or some way to move that stuff without having to carry it by hand. I'm not as young as I used to be, but I'm still as good as I was. Anyway, another story or a song. I think I've heard that. Let me pause here real quick. Ryan, do we have any questions before I start showing a few videos? I don't know if Ryan's here. Let me see if I can probably switch this and see if there's.
Sorry, I'm here, John. I didn't mean.
Okay, I just didn't know if there was any questions.
Looks like you've been covering all the questions without them having to ask them so far.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, we'll have another chance for you guys to ask some questions here at the end. Let me show you a few videos. See if this will come up.
Hi, this is John, just giving you a view of a bee waterer. You can see there's a bee down there getting some water now. It's late in the season. There's several of them in here. If I can bring you in. They're still collecting water. This is early November. This bee waterer is basically a flower pot, plastic one. It's got a solar water fountain here. When the sun hits it, it gets some movement on the water just to kind of help with the mosquitoes. We like to keep mosquitoes out of it. Other than that, we don't do too much to this water. It's rainwater overflow from this rain barrel. And you can see it's kind of messy up here, but the bees kind of like it like that. We've sliced pool noodle to give the bees some landing pads. And you can see they rather enjoy the water. In the summer when it's really hot, this thing is just covered with bees. But I just want to give you a view of one option for watering your bees. Just as an example, this is another one. This is actually a chicken feeder, and I can put a little dome on here and put some water on it. And the bees are happy to drink out of it. That's why all these stones are in here to give the bees some landing pads. And again, this is just rainwater collection that comes off of my workshop.
So that's just the example of one of my bee waterers. My other one is I get them in my pool once in a while. That's another good tip is providing if you have bees in your backyard and you have neighbors with pools, providing a good bee waterer will help keep the neighbors a little more happy and have the bees less likely to find your neighbor's pools, because they will find them. This is another video.
Another part of our bee yard is this new hugelkultur bed, it's a raised bed. We're still planting it up. We just finished putting it together. It's going to have native plants, nectar and pollen sources for the bees. A couple of plants that we have in here are Texas kidneywood. That's this big one here on the end. And another Texas kidneywood down there in the middle. It's got a Texas mountain laurel. And we're still putting some plants on this. So trying to provide some natural resources for the bees.
And that's a new endeavor that we've been working on. Container gardens is another option.
Here's kind of a container garden there's some bees flying around through here. They're finding some resources even this late in the year. We've had jalapenos in here. There's still quite a number of jalapenos. You can see several of them on the plants there. This here in front of me is a bee stand that I've converted for holding plants for now. And there's a variety of basil and other plants in here. There's some milkweed, there's redbud, there's several things for them to get some resources from. Not a huge thing. We're gonna put in more garden space in this open expanse, but it's a work in progress.
So that's just one option for us to put in some resources for the bees. One of the things I like to note is I like to share plants with my neighbors, especially plants that are great for pollinators, because that helps me grow my bee yard and I don't have to pay taxes for it, so to speak. So I give my neighbors plants that are good for bees. It's good for the bees, and I get to have more resources out there without having to put it into my actual yard.
Bringing over here to a few of my beehives. Let me zoom in here. I don't want to get too close, but I'm overwintering a nuke there. And that was a really good queen. That's a 2020 queen that's in there. She had a large hive, but something happened with that hive, and they left the queen behind, and she was just there was just a few bees in her hive. Probably 4 boxes deep. So I found her and gave her some new comb and some new bees, and she's growing that out. You can see that's quite active. I'll need to get in there and check on that queen and that colony pretty soon. We are fortunate enough to be able to do some overwintering in nukes here in the DFW area. This is an 8 frame with a guardian beehive entrance. We can talk about that. You can see there's another one down there, and it's also got a guardian. But these hives are pretty active. This is November 10th. I guess, well, November 9th is what it is, off by a day. But it's beautiful today, and the bees are obviously out flying.
I'm going to talk a little bit more about this setup here. Let me show you a quick video where let's see, I think it's on this one. No, anyway, let me back out real quick. So that beehive stand, those bees that you saw, basically they face south, and they're faced directly into a red tip photinia hedgerow that's probably near 20 feet tall. Those bees are pointing directly at my neighbor's backyard, but because they point into that the hedgerow, the bees don't fly directly towards my neighbor's back door. They have to come out and then go up or go around, and they find their way around without, creating a direct line of sight or direct flight path across my neighbor's backyard. her house is probably 150 feet or so away from those beehives, her back door. I have had one hive there that was on the end of that row that, they were a little more defensive, but really only so when her lawn guys came. They have a really loud lawnmower, big lawnmower, and a really, really loud weed whacker that they bring back there. And that colony decided that was a threat. And, she got a couple of her lawn guys got stung. So it's one of those things you have to be prepared for if you're going to have bees in neighborhoods, to get that call from your neighbor saying, hey, your bees are causing problems for me. Whether they're your bees or not, if they get stung, they're your bees, and you're going to have to be prepared for that. So it's one of those things, plan for it, know what you're getting into, and then trying to, provide the best situation that you can. In that case, what I did is I moved that colony from that location and moved it to a different spot in my bee yard, and didn't have a problem with them after that. They didn't go after the yard guys, even though I only moved them probably 50 feet. That was enough, and pointing them into a different direction, that they didn't, they haven't bothered the lawn guys since then. And she still has those really loud lawn guys. Anyway, talk about some bee stands here real quick.
I'm going to give you an idea of one way to build beehive stands. Those are 2x4s with 4x4 posts. Each stand there has 6 4x4 posts, and then they're just all screwed together with 2x4s, and they work really well. You can see there's a 5-stack box right there on that one, constructed the exact same way. As another example of a way to build a beehive stand, I'll bring you up to this one. You can see this is also a nuke that I'm overwintering. And this is just a stand that's put together with cinder blocks with landscape timbers. Well, like all the neighborhood dogs are barking. So I live in a neighborhood. And that's just another way to build a beehive stand.
So that one has been in place for a while. I've had, I think, 5 bees on that, beehives on that landscape timber cinder block one, even as late as this summer. I had about 5 of them on there.
Here's another example of a beehive stand. It's just PVC that's glued together and put into the ground about 2 feet. This stand will hold a hive at least 4 or 5 high. This one particular hive stand had a hive that was fully loaded with 3 boxes of honey and 2 brood chambers earlier this year. Obviously, it's been relocated. Right next to it is another beehive stand, again 4x4s that have 2x4 cross members. On top, you can see I took a little square out of the 4x4s, just enough to set the 2x4s into. And this will hold a good amount of weight as well. And back with this off. Again, it's just another example of a beehive stand.
And that one beehive stand there, the one standalone, is really handy because if you need to pop something up really quick, it's easy to move around. If you need to set something in place, even just temporarily, it's really stout, and it allows you to ratchet strap. I do ratchet straps or bricks, and I prefer to do ratchet straps on my hives. And that lets that happen pretty easily. Just one other quick thing here.
One other note I wanted to make about this bee yard is, you notice these hives over here are in full sun. They get some morning sunshine. They're facing east. I'll zoom in and see if you might actually be able to see bees flying in and out of that right now. I'm out here with no protection at all, just kind of standing somewhat close by. But anyway, they face east, these ones. They're in full sun all day. I'm not sure it's the best idea, especially when it's hot, really, really hot. I try to do my best to make sure they've got plenty of water, plenty of resources close by to cool the hive. Conversely, those hives over there are in full shade almost all the time. I didn't notice any difference between quality of the honey or amount or any issues with the hives, shade versus sun. I think possibly there might be a little bit of better protection from hive beetle in the sun, but yeah, you know Texas, and Texas can get really hot. So, you know, it's one of those things. I'm still kind of learning and playing with what I want to do. I might actually put some shade in for these hives over here. But we're going to see. I actually have been playing with some what they call ultimate hive covers, which is more of an insulated hive cover to keep some heat out of the upper boxes. And I'm still doing some testing with those.
Yeah, and so far, the limited amount of testing I did with what they call the ultimate hive covers, which is kind of like, I guess it's like a polystyrene, styrene, hard plastic cover. It's insulated. It seems to be pretty positive. I know when I put it on in the late summer, I switched out a typical metal covered hive top with one of the ultimate hive covers. When I took off the metal one, there were hardly any bees up in the top because it was hot up there. As soon as I put in that ultimate hive cover one, it definitely provided some insulation, and the bees came back up into that upper box. So it's something I'm still working and playing with a little bit. Is there any questions at this point? Otherwise, I'll show you one more video. Let's see if I can get over here. It won't show me the chat right now. I don't know. So Ryan, do we have any questions?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. We had at least one. Let me see. We had a question from Maitri about the floats for the bees to land on. And her question is, if you have a pond rather than a barrel or a pot waterer, do you still see floating things as something we need to provide?
Well, you know, it's interesting. If you have a pond, I don't think I would worry about it. Of course, it depends on the size of the pond, but the shoreline of the water is where they're going to find their landing pads anyway, so I wouldn't worry too much about it. But when it's on like a pot, like I've got, you know, it's just, you know, there's nothing for the bees to actually latch onto. I don't seem to have any trouble with them, you know, crawling right down to the water line. So it's mostly for my protection, not to drown bees in the plastic pot. On a pond, you know, with natural pond where they've got the leaves and any vegetation around the pond, you don't have to worry about it.
And Maitri, forgive me if I'm telling secrets on your backyard, but I believe in her case specifically, we're talking about a koi pond set into the ground in the backyard. Kind of a midpoint between the two, wild versus contained.
Yeah, well, I think it's as long as it's got vegetation and it's not, you know, plastic sided, you know, hard sided where the bees might slip down and not have a way to get out. Yeah, I don't think you need to worry about it. Wonderful.
And we had some praise and some questions about the PVC hive stand. Praise that looked neat and like a good idea, and questions about the rationale behind it. Do we think it prevents things from entering the hive? Is there anything specifically that you would recommend or caution us about the PVC?
Well, you know, here's the interesting thing is when I first put those in, I built those. My idea of being a beekeeper was I would probably have a maximum of, you know, just a couple hives in my backyard. That was my first year. And I quickly went from 2 hives and that expanded to 5 within my first year, to over 25 the following spring. The original idea to have that was really, it was really a kind of aesthetic thing. I've set up just a small space for having the bees. It worked really well for a single hive. No problem with them at all. I was able to do some things with putting some like tanglefoot type of stuff around the PVC to help keep the ants out of it. And that was kind of one of the ideas of having that, was being able to help with the ants. And so I didn't have any negative piece for that. One thing that you probably want to be aware of, mine, I think I made it just a little narrow. It'll fit a 10 frame deep, no problem, but it's just right to the edge. And I think I would probably make it just a little wider in my case. So, make sure if you were to build one, make sure it's wide enough to hold the equipment that you want it to hold. It's really nice because you can ratchet strap it down, and underneath of that PVC, it's probably not the, I put in roof shingles to kind of help with, one with the ants and weeds, and small hive beetle, and just trying to help with that whole situation. And I covered it with mulch, so it looks really nice. Obviously for me and where I went, it was not practical to do that for every hive stand that I have, but those really do work. And if you're only going to have a couple of hives and you're going to set them up somewhere, they'll work no problem. I didn't see any issue with them. Those are several years old now, and they still look as good as they did. You can paint them any color you want. I kind of painted them the same color as my house, so they kind of blended in.
My apologies, I forgot to unmute there. In terms of anchoring it, how deeply does it need to be anchored?
Well, for our purposes, we don't have to go too deep around here. You'll want it, mine are about 2 feet deep. They go down about 2 feet deep. And that gives plenty of rigidity and stability. It's not too deep. They're not concreted in. I just dug a hole with my brain just went dead. The post hole digger, that's what it is. And with the post hole digger, and put it in, and then refilled it in with dirt. Didn't put any concrete in because I wasn't sure I was going to keep them in the long run. But that was stable enough that they didn't have any issue.
Wonderful. We also got a question about your jump from 2 hives to quite a few in year 2.
Okay,
how intentional was that? Perhaps is the root of the question.
So here comes the story. We have plenty of space here. Like I said, we're on 1.25 acres, and my first foray into beekeeping actually was, we thought about it. We had a hive in the workshop here. It hadn't built it. It was still in the box. And one day I was out by my chickens. We had some chickens out there, and we still have a chicken coop. I need to get back out there. I haven't finished it yet, James. If James is still here, he's been helping me with that here in time once in a while. So I need to get back out there. But I was out there with the chickens, and I looked up and I was looking at this little grove of hackberry trees. And I was looking, I said, well, I'm going to have to do something about those hackberry trees eventually. They're between my house, my yard, my neighbor's yard, and we both have chicken coops. And I'd hate to have those things come down in a storm and on either one of our chicken runs and chicken coops. So I was looking at them, and I was looking up, and I said, what the heck is that? And I looked up, and there was an aerial beehive. It was probably 8 combs wide on a branch, probably about 30 feet up in the air. And they must have been there for quite a while. I mean, they built, 8 combs, pretty substantial combs, and there were a lot of bees on it. I didn't even know they were there during that time. And so that kind of got me started into the bees. that was probably maybe October of that year. I can't even remember when that was. I barely remember what I had for dinner last night anymore. But anyway, it was probably about October, and I did a little research on trying to find a way to, get up there and, bring the hot bees down, because, winter was coming and I knew they weren't going to make it through winter. It's like, what am I supposed to do? So I tried to do some research on figuring out how to get them. Never managed to get that. I did put out some bee water and feed and put it out. I built the hive and I put that out there and said, well, bees, maybe you can move down into my beehive. No, they had their own thing. And sure enough, come winter, the bees were gone. I never found a dead bee. They probably moved on, found a better location. So they moved on. So it was that winter I started doing some research on beekeeping, and met my buddy James Gluba. He might be on here. He was a beekeeper that was moving here. He was moving from out of state. And that spring, the following spring, I actually ordered a package of bees. It was actually a package of bees, and the post office was really happy about that. I got a call early in the morning and said, "Hey, your bees are here. Can you come get them?" And there were bees actually on the outside of the package, so they were happy when I showed up to come get them. But brought those home, put those into a War hive, which not many people have Warrays around here. There's a few people. So I started with a Warray, and then my buddy James got into town, and he gave me a split from one of his colonies. So that was our first two colonies. One was a package, and one was a split. The colonies that came afterwards, and we went from 2 to 5, and the 3 others, let me think. I didn't do a nuke that year, so but we might have done another split. I can't remember. But anyway, we ended up with a couple of swarms that we captured. I have a neighbor that's not too close by, but somewhat close by, who is one of those, he's a bee haver, and he's got a couple of hives out on his orchard. And I'm pretty sure I catch swarms from his bees. Those bees, I'm sure, I know it was them. When springtime came, they weren't very friendly bees. They were, let's say, what's the term we use, Ryan? Defensive? They were very defensive. And we had to split those 2 colonies from those 2 out to about 20. That's how small we had to make them to get them to the point where we could actually work with them. And that was that, as a relatively new beekeeper, I woke up a couple of mornings and said, I'm done. I can't deal with that. We have bees coming, off all over the property, and we would get stung. They would come and chase you, no matter where you were. So we had to do something. And my neighbor has a direct line of sight to where my bees are. And I told her, I actually saw her and her husband, they were walking their dogs. And I said, I wanted to give you a heads up. We got some kind of mean bees out there, but I'm dealing with them. We're getting ready to take care of them. She said, oh, no problem, no problem. And we love the bees, and they've got some pollinator friendly plants in their backyard, and so they really love the bees. And that next day, I saw her, and her face was swollen. I mean, significantly swollen, and she'd been stung in the face. And I said, I'm so sorry. And I apologized profusely. And we knew we had to deal with the bees. And I told her, I said, well, you're going to get our first jar of honey. When we ever get honey, you get the first one. And sure enough, we got honey. And she was the first one who ever had any of our honey before I even had any. So we gave her honey. And she's still, they're still our neighbors, and they still appreciate the bees. And she comes over and buys honey from me every year. But that's how we went from that small number to that big number really quickly. Is basically we had to break down a couple of beehives and do some major splits. and requeening to be able to work those hives and be comfortable in our own yard. So that's that story.
Wonderful. I did not see any more questions pop up in the chat during that. If anybody does have any more questions, now's the time to ask them while John's still talking to us about it.
Yeah, I've got, I can show you, we did from the Zoom meeting, I can bring that up and we can show that really quickly. Let me just share this real quick.
12 hives back here, and my house is right behind me too, so it's just on the other side of the fence. There's a saltwater pool. Just kind of giving some reference. We're on about an acre and a quarter, and right at the top of Lake Ray Hubbard. Brian, right now I'm trying to make some honey. I'm hoping for some honey. It's been a bad spring so far. We haven't seen too much nectar coming in. I think we're just starting to see some come in.
And that was this year, by the way.
Which there's a nice big one that's just off this way off camera, is just now starting to pop. I can smell it. It just smells so good right now up here. Lots of nectar coming from that.
That's a privet tree, by the way.
Any other type of introduction you thinking, Ryan, or shall I turn the camera and start looking at some beehives?
Well, I definitely agree with you on the nectar flow. It's been a rough year, and I'm seeing hints of headed out of it right now. So here's fingers crossed.
Yeah, well, I have one neighbor that's got a tallow tree. We've got a whole lot of my neighbors coming up with a lawnmower, so he may or may not see me and may or may not go somewhere else with it. But anyway, so tallow and privet, there's a hedgerow probably 2 blocks away that is, I want to say there's maybe a dozen of the privet trees, and they're probably 25 to 30 feet tall and just full of blooms right now. So they're just popping. It's like the rain came and left right at the right time for it. So that's all good.
So
The only other thing I was gonna.
I'll show speed this up a little bit.
That's not so bad. We broke that colony down from I guess they were two. It was a deep and 2 supers at that point, and we split them to about 20 hives. That's how bad we had to get them down and re-clean them.
That's that same story I just told you.
With 5 hives, and pretty much over that weekend, I ended up with nearly 30.
Wow.
So here I'll show you where we open one of our hives up. The audio is not too great on this, but
it's a good idea when you open your lid. I kind of take a peek at it.
What I'm saying there is when you open your hive to take a look at the lid, because many times you might find, it's good to find the queen. You could find the queen up there, so it's good to look. That's a good, strong colony.
There's a lot of bees.
Yeah.
This is a honey super, by the way. It's a deep honey super. So that's encouraging to see all those bees up.
So I don't want to go too far into that, but that's one of the benefits, just to kind of plug TVBs and Metro with our clubs. We have a set of courses that we go through, and that was from one of the courses are actually in the bee yard, where the students get to come into the bee yard, and typically we actually have them in the bee yard with us. This year, obviously with COVID, we had to do it virtually, so that was from that situation, that scenario. But typically we have people in our yards. We go through beehives, open them up, look for queens. And just one quick note about that: when you open a bee colony, you don't feel like you have to find the queen every time. It's a good idea to find evidence of the queen, but don't feel like you need to find the queen. And if you can't find her, that you failed. look for evidence that she's been there. Look for eggs and larvae and capped brood. So learn what you have in your colony, and don't worry so much about finding that one. On a really strong colony, there's sometimes I go months without seeing the queen, but I always make sure I find evidence that she's been there. Just to bring up that one slide there. Any questions or any discussion that you want to have? I see some things flashing there, but you can definitely feel free to email me. I'm on Facebook. I started a YouTube channel, so we share some stuff out there. We're happy to talk with anybody. And in normal years, we're happy to have people out and walk through and show what we're doing here. I know I've got several neighbors now that have started beekeeping, and they came over before they got started. We walked through some hives and showed them what we're doing and how to do things. So that's pretty much it. Unless we've got some questions, I'm happy to answer.
It looks like we've got a couple questions in the chat. Let's go ahead and see if we can squeeze them in before we have to pass the metaphorical microphone to Jeremy. Cecilia asks about the raised bed configuration, the purpose of the mound. I think she's talking about the hugelkultur bed.
Yeah, so that's an interesting, it's new for us. Underneath of that, what we started, now I'm going to be doing a YouTube video on it from start to finish, but essentially it's a German method of raised beds. Underneath of it is we started with cardboard. We put logs. We've got some property, and we've had a few trees that have come down. So all the logs that have been accumulating in piles for some of them a couple of years. We put those there, and then any branches of debris that we've cut out, any trees or just pruning, leaves. We put bags of leaves in there. Sawdust from cutting some stuff, building beehives, that type of stuff. Sawdust, and then once that was done, I got a couple loads of horse manure, covered that whole thing up, all the logs and everything, with horse manure, and let that set for a little while. It was aged to begin with, but I let it set for a little while. And then once that was done, I went and picked up some good soil from one of the local soil stores, so to speak, the dirt store, and got some good soil and threw that on top of it. It's about 3 yards of soil that's on there. The whole thing is probably about 25 feet long, and I'd say it's probably about 3 feet, maybe 3 feet tall at the highest spot right now. And that's all we're going to do all native flowers, pollinator friendly flowers. It's all that's all that's going on there. We do our veggies in actual separate raised bed. It's a cedar raised bed. So that's what that mound is for. It helps me clear debris and do something good for the bees.
Yeah, you're good at those multi-purpose actions. I love that. One last question. We're going to have to be slightly brief about it to stay on schedule. But JLT Dallas asks, from a beginner perspective, why would you choose not to have a queen screen or divider, a queen excluder, I think, between your supers? And what is the risk that the queen flies away from the cover as you open your hive?
Well, those are good questions. And again, if you ask 10 beekeepers, you're going to get a bunch of different answers. Here's my take. I typically will leave a deep and a super, whether that's a deep super or a medium super, for the bees. That's, whatever they can fill in there, they fill it up. I try to leave that for the bees. And then I put a queen excluder on. And a lot of people will tell you don't need to. They call them a honey excluder. I use them. Do you need to? No, but I use them. I put them up, I put that up there, and then the bees, anything above that is for me. And that's what I harvest. Is there any risk? And so there's a couple of things there. If you have a queen excluder and for your honey supers, the queen is not likely to be above. Is it possible that it can happen? It can happen, but it's not likely to happen. as you're growing your bees and you don't need queen excluders, you're not to that point yet. The chance of the queen being up there, I've seen queens on the lids and the inner covers. The risk of her flying away is pretty minimal. But when you're opening your colony, you're opening your hive, it's like I said, it's a good idea to look at it, see if you see her walking around. And if you do, just kind of, set that down, and she'll typically walk down into the hive anyway. She doesn't want to go anywhere else. I have had queens fly away from colonies, but I think in every case that's happened, I've come back the next day and she's there. So it does happen. It's rare. Will you see it? Probably not. Can it happen? Yeah, but it's not likely.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that, John. Thank you for doing this for us today. We really appreciate you. We feel like you gave us a lot of good information.